we meet on site every Friday morning at 7 a.m. I wasn't sure whether it was going to like feel like too much or what was going to happen week to week, but yeah, like some weeks more things happen than others. But at the same time, whether it's a discussion around what's happened over the past week and what's happening the next, it is very much that time to discuss kind of things forward looking, or things that were on my mind, or things that I wasn't anticipating that the builder wanted to talk, or whether it's problem solving. And that also, I think, like keeps me from feeling that I need to contact the builder whenever anything kind of new enters my mind, or I have a question. Like, I really have to think. I was like, well, is this super urgent? Can this wait until Friday? I think most of the time that it can. And I think the builder's probably doing something along the same lines, because he will need to contact me during the week, but a lot of things are just reserved for that.
Well, Ben, it is so great to have you back on the podcast. I'm so looking forward to catching up with you about where things are at. As we were just chatting about before we started recording, it's your Friday wins. You shared a photograph of where construction is up to, and I know with Home Method members like you, where it's probably felt like such a long time coming for you. And I see this photograph of this house that's under construction with cladding on it and the roof on it, and really starting to take form. And I find it's really interesting for me, because we've always you and I have done these one-to-one Zoom calls as well with the podcast, but we've also, you've been doing the member upgrades with the Zoom consults along the way a couple of times as well. So I've already walked around in your head and seen it visually, from the outside. And I think I kind of sometimes it's this weird kind of thing of having a foot in both worlds, where I know the level of excitement you will be experiencing seeing this come to fruition after so much planning and intention and care and preparation and research and all of the involvement that you've had. And at the same time, my other foot's sitting in my professional world, where like this was already a real building in my head, because that's how I see it when I look at the drawings. It's like, it's just sort of, I've just been waiting for it to kind of get to where it was in my head. So just if you could, before we dive in, can you just give us a quick snapshot of where construction is at the moment, so everybody understands where you're up to?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's, I walk through there and I was like, oh, I've seen this before. Well, I've seen this before because it's been in my head for like the past, however many years. So yeah, it's this strange level of sort of familiarity and newness, which is kind of exciting. So I guess, like, in terms of the stages, I guess we're in the frame stage. I think that's it, where the wall, the floor is down, the walls have gone up, and finally the roof's on, which was a long time coming. It felt like, I'm so relieved that I don't have to watch the weather forecast every week and look at how much rain's gonna, rain down on this exposed timber frame, because it's roofed. And the windows most of the windows are in, and the cladding is supposed to be going on this week. So the building itself is starting to take shape.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And so can we talk a bit more about how things have felt up to this point? When we spoke last time, we were talking about how to sort of run site meetings, about being, getting there a little bit early to walk around and check things before you actually had the conversation with the builder. How's that all been traveling for you up to this point in the project?
Yeah, pretty all right. Like, I do feel like now we're in a bit of a rhythm, right? So we meet on site every Friday morning at 7 a.m. I wasn't sure whether it was going to like feel like too much or what was going to happen week to week, but yeah, like some weeks more things happen than others. But at the same time, whether it's a discussion around what's happened over the past week and what's happening the next, it is very much that time to discuss kind of things forward looking, or things that were on my mind, or things that I wasn't anticipating that the builder wanted to talk, or whether it's problem solving. And that also, I think, like keeps me from feeling that I need to contact the builder whenever anything kind of new enters my mind, or I have a question. Like, I really have to think. I was like, well, is this super urgent? Can this wait until Friday? I think most of the time that it can. And I think the builder's probably doing something along the same lines, because he will need to contact me during the week, but a lot of things are just reserved for that Friday. And yeah, that helps. That I do think that, like, I don't know, it feels like a professional way to conduct this which I think really like. So yeah, like on along those lines, it does feel like it's kind of a project, and we're just doing this, on a week to week basis and seeing progress. And eventually, like it's funny because like I'll be really in that kind of sequential, almost like work mode, and yeah, the fact that this is going to be the home that we live in, sometimes I forget. Strangely.
But that's the thing. You've been operating like such a great project manager in how
Yeah.
you have kind of prepared for this project and then, got yourself set up for execution. And I love hearing that sort of idea of rhythm and any builders who are listening who get fed up with being interrupted throughout the week with calls from clients with their latest thoughts on their mind, please heed the fact that a regular site meeting is probably the answer to solving all of that. Because when you've got a builder who has proactively obviously planned this project and you as a client have proactively planned this project, then it does mean that you've got this reliable hotspot of communication where you're going to get to be on site. You're going to have a forum for those conversations and those concerns, and it's going to happen in a manner with some structure around it so that you can be feeling like that it's not just being lost, because they're in the car somewhere and they've not noted it down, and all of those kinds of things. So it's it is a like you say, it's a professional way to run a project. And when you're spending this much money, you want somebody who's going to run it professionally, and you're going to want to feel like it's being taken care of professionally. So I love that that's been your experience.
And also, I'd like to mention, like, it is definitely project progression, but I think it's also this relationship maintenance thing because, like, there's nothing, there can be a lot of correspondence, whether it's text messages or email, etc. But especially when there's either questions or, you think something not necessarily off track, but like there's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Sometimes just having that, whether it's on the phone or even better in person, it just helps. It's a lot more. You don't find yourself in a situation where something's either misconstrued or etc. We're just actually spending time together as two people, so that really, I think, that has helped feel like now we're in a different stage of the relationship, which I had been told that it is this relationship during the build process, and now I understand that even better.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, and you're not having to worry about the tone in an email or, also, that sense of panic or urgency that you can have when that just accidentally gets conveyed in an
Mm-hmm.
email or a message like that, instead there's a methodical approach to it, which just lowers the stress levels overall, and really does set up a far better, smoother construction process. So it's really brilliant that that's been your experience. And I think too, because you've done so much work to understand the construction process through what you've learned in home method, and it does become that beautiful thing that we talk about where it's a weekly show and tell, and then you're forward planning, okay, what decisions have we got coming up? What do I need to be aware of? How can I still stay ahead of the curve on this so that I'm never sort of feeling like I'm putting out fires or in a reactionary state about sort of really important, significant decisions?
I agree. And one more quick thing about these site meetings that I've really enjoyed, and I've been so pleased. So now the builder has started to use that time slot to bring in like sub trades or some of the people that he's contracting to whether either answer my questions directly or take us through stuff. So it's, that's being seen as just like a really good time. And I've really conveyed my appreciation for bringing those people in as appropriate. So it's been great to see what I'm perceiving as a positive reaction from the builder to those as well.
That is awesome. That is
Yeah.
so awesome because it means then, I mean, we talk about you're never supposed to speak directly to the trades, but when the builder actually is the one that's bringing that communication together and you get to hear at the coalface why something has to be the way that it is or what possibilities there are if you're trying to kind of problem solve with things, that you're not then relying on the builder to kind of pass things on secondhand, that you can really have that collaborative approach to it.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. I'm so glad that the builder is embracing that this way, and that that's just all sorts of green flags. That's absolutely fantastic.
It's been great to see.
And so, have there been any unexpected discoveries along the way, and how have you actually gone about resolving and adapting to those as they've come up?
During the build process, I think one of the biggest things has been the roof and how that's been, I guess, like insulated, or like how that's been dealt with in terms of the that sub level under the roof itself, in terms of being able to manage um, condensation and water infiltration. Originally, as part of getting educated about buildings and how that works, I learned so much about condensation and how roofs can and should be constructed to manage that, and how that leads into so many things, like a well maintained building, a healthy home, avoiding mold. I really had so little idea at the beginning, and now, I mean, I can, speak with a lot of confidence why a flat roof introduces so many more challenges. And really, through this process and through both home method and our one-to-ones, we actually, we made this big pivot to from a flatter roof to a pitched roof, which I'm super happy with, and to partly to manage the condensation, and and also to make the water management much easier. So as part of what we specified during the, I guess, like pre-build, just specified as part of the contract documents, was a class 4 vapor permeable membrane for just underneath the roof sheets, to make sure that humidity could get out and water couldn't get in. And that was, reasonably well received by the builder as part of the specification processes. And I've even been included in some correspondence with the prospective roofer. And in addition to that, we also asked and ended up specifying ventilation, like eave vents and ridge vent, to make sure that that was part of it. So when it came time to the roof was going to soon go on, I just wanted to, I had sent a couple of emails and had the discussion around verifying the way that we were going to do it, certainly. But we documented this all like months and months ago, but it would just be good to touch on it before things actually went on. And through that series of questions, that was the first time where the builder brought somebody to site. So we ended up, I walked in on a Friday morning and the builder said, "Oh, we have a special guest star today. Like, you had all these questions, and I brought Ryan, and he's going to be able to answer all your questions." So we started talking through that. It was evident that the roofer was, super experienced, but in terms of the work that they often do with a vapor permeable membrane on the roof, the what a lot of people know is that things have changed in I guess, in the construction industry, but certainly with the National Construction Code, and things are being done in this new way, and vapor permeable membranes are newer than anti-con blanket and other ways that you insulate or you manage roof condensation in a cold climate. And he had some of the equipment there that he was going to end up using, and then the three of us, me, the builder, and the roofer, started talking through how this was going to go on. And actually, a lot of conversation. It was nice to be there, because the builder and the roofer were talking about, all right, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to tie it into the frame, and etc. And then it became evident that there needed to be like counter battens and a few things in the roof that weren't originally anticipated, and just a little bit of problem solving on the spot and thinking how we can do things. And then, like, the discussion went like a number of different ways, and it was evident that it would have, in an ideal world, the resolution of exactly how the roof was going to tie into walls and all that kind of thing with a vapor permeable membrane could have been thought about again earlier in the process, and without going into too much detail, whether it would introduce, how are we just going to manage on-site construction issues with that. And on site, we used a lot of the, just kind of like stood there on our phones watching some installation videos just to verify. And that was another thing too, just knowing that the manufacturers of these building materials have a lot of information on their websites, and to use it. So it was evident that, a few things needed to be sorted out, and the roofer decided to, I'm going to get in touch with that company that was doing it, that the manufacturer of the product, and find out a little bit more. So let's not proceed with this today. We'll come back to it. In the intervening, actually, couple of weeks, it became evident that, the going with the original plan would be on the one hand, preferable in terms of I feel like it's the gold standard in terms of achieving our objectives, which is, managing condensation and, water infiltration, but also that there was a large degree of, I don't know, not necessarily retrospective work, but like additional things that needed to be, considered and done because of the fact that this was like a little bit new and that required maybe a slightly adjusted approach doing some of the previous work. And then the question came up, like, what if we went with one of the other solutions, the more familiar anti-con blanket? And at the beginning, I really had there was like just a strong reluctance where it's like, oh, I did all this work. I understand this is the best thing. I really don't want to set us up for trouble or issues. And I thought I did. And also, like, it was probably I was like, I thought I did everything to, set up what we wanted. And, in the same vein, started just, to consider the alternative. What would that actually look like, to understand it? Would it be less of a gold standard? Would it be a silver standard? Would it be a bronze standard? Would it still be something acceptable? What were the pros and cons of that a little bit different approach, and not just pros and cons with the physical, product and how it would perform, but also, the installation, the confidence, the ability, like a little bit of the relationship management, and just like the prospective extra work that there would be. And yeah, would that be an acceptable solution? So really tried to like bring it back to what we were trying to achieve. And in the end, I think taking all those factors together, it was my judgment, I think, that a well-installed silver standard or bronze standard is preferable to, I don't know, not just, I'm sure it would have been installed fine, but just like, I guess, like a familiar, well-resolved, low anxiety, new, something that was a little bit new. And also, I'm also conscious, like, there's a long journey ahead of us, sort of like with this build, and things will come up. So was this something that I wanted to, that I wanted to push as hard as possible, and made that decision that, that well-resolved silver or bronze standard is acceptable, and we're moving forward, and I think I'm okay with it.
Thank you so much for that detailed run through, because I think this is you've pretty much described in a snapshot one scenario that really illustrates the challenge that a lot of homeowners are experiencing, because we are at this nexus of a lot of accelerated change in the industry, and we've got obviously building codes and regulations that are bridging this gap between, the buildings that have been created and how they've been created for a very long time versus what we're trying to move towards. And we're sort of in this interesting kind of interstitial space of that, where we've got also professionals in the industry who are trying to upskill themselves to learn it, don't necessarily have the experience of constructing it on site. And it is that thing of, yes, in an ideal world, it would have been detailed exactly as it was intended. It would have been documented. The builder would have understood what was required. It would have all been priced, and that would have worked. And I think I recall, because you obviously came to the Home Method Facebook group with questions about it, and
Yes.
and so and it's a similar situation that lots of Home Method members are in, because they're navigating they're navigating an industry where anti-con has been considered the gold standard, and now this vapor permeable membrane and the counter battening and creating the continuous airtight envelope is what sort of people are moving towards. But that obviously requires a slightly different approach to the detailing of how the wall joins the roof, and how you can then ensure you've got airtightness around. Because if you invest in a vapor permeable membrane and it's not airtight, you've got problems. So it is that thing of like, you don't want to, as you said, you don't want a poorly executed ideal scenario. Instead, could you look at getting a well-executed scenario that is, and then mitigate the challenges? Because obviously the thing that I think is often sort of spoken about with anti-con blanket is that it is something that can still, obviously, if you've got humidity moving through your building and it hits that foil lining of the anti-con, condensation can form. So it's that opportunity of how do you actually still ventilate and dry out those roof spaces so you don't have that condensation dripping on something that's then going to cause mold down the track. So there are ways of detailing the anti-con to mitigate that. And obviously anti-con is something that has been used. I think what's fascinating with anti-con is a lot of people go into it thinking that it's a really great insulative product, and the NatHERS modeling rewards anti-con as well in the way that it's kind of measured, but in practicality when you actually install it, because it gets compressed over the top of the battens and things like that, it never, I don't believe it actually really delivers on that insulative outcome that it promotes that it does, just because of how it physically has to be installed. But what you were seeking was obviously some kind of way of mitigating the moisture, creating that continuity of that thermal envelope, looking at how you ventilate the roof, all of those kinds of things. And so, yeah, what I loved watching you do in that moment, Ben, was juggle that internal kind of challenge of, but it's not going how I thought it was going to go, and demonstrating that resilience and that strategic problem solving mindset, working collaboratively with your team to create an outcome where you're still managing your risk and working to, within the kind of confines of what you were navigating. And in my mind, that's the stuff that comes up all the time in a custom project, is that those scenarios will come up all the time. You can't avoid them. They're always there. And what I love about how you were able to operate in that moment, and what I love about how Home Method members generally can operate in those moments, is you can then occupy that strategic, resilient, flexible, adaptable mindset to figure, like, rather than falling in a heap and stepping out of that conversation, letting other people, giving up all your agency. And the fact that you were informed about that part of your process meant that, like, how did it because I imagine that the flip side is, for people who haven't educated themselves about it, all of that terminology would have sounded so confusing, or you would just have just trusted that those people were making the right decision for you. Like, how the fact that you could stand there and actually feel confident to, like, watch a video, to talk about the various things that we talk about, like, how did that feel for you in that moment, once you sort of got over the fact of, like, oh, I'm not actually going to get exactly what I want, or I'm going to have to really figure out how this is going to work? Like, how were you, or were you just so focused on how do we find a problem, how do we find a solution to this problem, you weren't even really thinking about like the fact that
There are actually a couple of things. There are a couple key moments, and there was one thing that I kept in mind throughout. Like, there was that moment the first day that we were there. That site meeting, I think, went for 2 hours, and which, like, yeah, much longer than. I'm glad we started really early, and just seeing the tone of the conversation slightly shift. Once well, a couple of different things. Like, when both the builder and the roofer were, talking to me about the advice, and certainly, like, as you would expect, they are the professional, and it's like they will know a lot more than I do, and speaking that way, and, like, trust, look, from my experience, like, trust me, like, I know these things, like, yeah, like, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I do trust you, and being conscious of, like, the couple of different things, like, at the same time. Number one, the way that I was answering those, like, not, just, accepting, and even if I maybe didn't disagree with something that they said, sort of, still tried to see it their way, or, not reacting poorly, making sure that it was it could have been a tense conversation, but I didn't want it to be, and it didn't need to be, because it was like, all right, like, let's just problem solve this, and even if I don't agree with something that's said, like, that's fine, like, I'll just provide my point of view. And there was in the beginning of that conversation, I was like, oh, I'm out of my depth. What am I even talking about? Like, why am I saying this? Like, I don't know anything. Like, I'm going to sound so stupid. And then, like, I got some words out, and it was, the moment that I was like, all right, let's check the website. Like, let's figure this out. And the tone of the conversation ended up changing. It became this, sort of more collaborative, like, oh, what about this? What if we did that? Then, almost like in the last part of that discussion, when the roofer was kind of taking me, it's all right, like, in the scenario where we would do the anti-con blanket, how would that fit in with the even roof ventilation product that we'd specified? And then the roofer, like, gets out this, goes to, like, some remnant piece of timber and starts, like, all right, starts drawing it out in a section. The roofer does. And I was just like, oh, well, like, first of all, that's so helpful. Second of all, at that moment, I felt respected, and I felt really sort of, like, brought in on things, and even demonstrated the roofer's, capabilities and professionalism and knowledge even more. And I was like, oh, okay. So walked away from that feeling really well. But then throughout this entire process, one of the other really important things that I wanted to mention was and I have to credit Mike to this. my other half, who, he can see when, he knows that I've dived really deep into these kinds of things, and, feels, strongly about these things, but making sure that, like, do not make this tense. Kind of like, do not make this tense, otherwise I'm leaving. And how, just like how it's not going to help anybody, like, no matter what happens throughout this, like, let's try to do that. So, I kept that in mind. But the other thing, just like recognizing what the fact that the roofer and the builder were engaging with these things, the fact that the builder brought the roofer, and that he was sort of like, answered all our questions, never, he didn't, like, the builder doesn't lose his cool. And just like saying, like, it was just how helpful, like, sending him a message afterwards, like, exactly how I felt. Like, this was actually, no matter what happens with this, it's really helpful to step through these. Thank you for bringing these. Like, I know this is sort of like complicated. And then, he comes back, he's like, yeah, no problem. It's a learning, it's a learning process for all of us. And just like, yeah, that's, no matter what, twists and turns, like, yeah, that vibe of sort of like, let's talk about that, not making it personal, and trying to have that collaborative mindset. So
Yeah.
that's been a good feeling.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And I think in all of that, what's being honored is your need for detail and your need to actually understand what's going on. Mike's obviously acting as the social lubricant and making sure that everybody's still being kind to each other, and it's
Really
not getting super tense. And this builder sounds awesome in terms of the fact that they have recognized what you need in order to feel more confident and certain in the process, and that they're embracing that, and also embracing their ability to learn in it as well. So it's just awesome to hear how it's going. And it's still so early in the piece, really. So to sort of see that, such a chunky decision like that has had that resolution pathway. And you've been able then to also tap into resources and things like that to feel like you can feel comfortable with the decision that you're making. Because the last thing that you want is to have felt backed into a corner, kind of just acquiesced to, oh, yeah, sure, well, fine, we'll go with it. I'm not 100% sure, but, like blah, blah, blah. And then it's this niggling kind of concern or regret the whole time now that you're proceeding them with this home. Instead, what's happened is there's been this notion of empowerment through that, so that you are confident in the decision, and you're balancing the priorities and weighing things up so that you can be actively owning that decision as well. So I think it's absolutely awesome. So, you've talked obviously a bit about how you're staying across communication there and your decisions, any variations. So are there any systems that you're specifically using to kind of navigate those kind of chunky conversations, and, obviously trying to make sure that communication is documented in some way? Like, how are you sort of navigating that in the project, and how have you noticed the builder doing anything? Like, what's happening in that regard?
So I guess I'm trying to scale my approach to, I guess, to what I need, what I think is needed for the project. And also I think what the builder's preferred mode of operation. Like, he's a builder that's, on the tools. So there's a lot going on, during the day. And, he's responsive. He's definitely responsive in writing, but in terms of, I'm aware that, he's not available, all day to sort of like, prepare, whether it's prepare documentation, respond to, I don't know, like respond to the needing to, like, I guess, needing to prepare long, detailed responses to written emails that I might provide. So I definitely use the site meetings as a chance to, well, number one, either like bring up things that I want to bring up, or, receive the things that I need to resolve. And, I'll write those down for myself. But then, like, when we are, whether I need to make a decision, or we're doing, because, right now we're dealing with the mechanical ventilation, like the options that we just talked through last Friday with the mechanical ventilation guy, it's like, I'll say like, oh, I'll, based on this conversation and what we're considering, I'll prepare an email and send it to the builder, and, detailing everything out. And then he'll either, if he needs to respond, or he'll provide it to them, and then it comes back. And then just, keeping a right amount of notes, but not over, like, I don't know, I'm conscious of not overwhelming with, this is exactly what was said at this particular time, like keeping rough notes, not holding it too tightly, to not, because I do think, in like, whether it's in my, professional life or whatever, yeah, like you can overwhelm people with over documenting things. And it's not to say that it doesn't document. So just, focusing on what needs to be put in writing, and then what if it doesn't, then we can, I will, take a note of things because I'll remember things a lot better that way. And just try to navigate it and not be dogmatic about any particular system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think it's this thing of like the custom residential world lives inside an industry that has both corporate and non-corporate entities in it, and a lot of custom
Yes.
residential builders haven't had any kind of corporate experience, and yet they'll be dealing with corporate professionals who have sat in meetings that do get minuted with an inch of their life, and and so it's this bridging of those kind of two worlds to make sure that you are managing your risk. You're not going to remember everything that you've discussed. You got to try and obviously document the things that you know are going to be important and significant and potentially give you opportunity for recourse should you require it. We talk a lot in Home Method about sort of picturing the worst case scenario, just making sure you're protecting yourself against that. And so
Yes.
I like this idea of sort of holding both those things. And I think it's a challenging kind of situation for the industry that a lot of building business owners aren't kind of running systems like this themselves in their businesses. So I do love the fact that you've kind of gone, okay, we'll work with how he needs to work and being on the tools and, all of that kind of stuff, but still make sure that this is being documented in a way that I feel confident and comfortable.
And just focusing on what's more like I've talked in previously about, in the scoping, in order to get to a signed contract, I wanted everything as documented as I could. That, everything I could think about, I wanted documented, whether sort of like in an email or documentation, because that at that point it was, it's super important. So just the weighing up, during the project, what needs to be super watertight and what can be a discussion.
Yeah. Awesome. Now, can we talk about how this whole thing is actually feeling for you? Because,
Yeah.
I remember when construction began, you posted some photographs in the Facebook group as the rear of the home was being demolished and then the extension structure got started. I mentioned, seeing we have our Friday wins post, which is always such a gorgeous post in the community to see everybody sharing sort of their progress wherever they're at and us all being able to cheer each other on. And you had photographs of like this building form that just, looks absolutely amazing. And it's got the wrap on it and all of that kind of stuff. How is it feeling for you seeing it finally come to fruition and these forms taking shape on site?
Surreal in a really positive way. Like the I'm yeah, like it actually like it gets me through the work week. Really, I'm like, oh, Friday we get to go to site and see what's happened, and just it's the culmination of a lot of work, but just seeing that after, whether you felt like you were sort of living in contemporary things or like waiting for something, you're like, oh, this is the this is the this is the thing that I've been working towards. And but at the same time, like, managing your expectations about how long this is going to take. Like, this is going to be months. Like, this is like, don't get too excited about this. So kind of enjoy it. That level of, I've seen this before, because it's been, I've been, rattling it around in my head and just, looking at these plans and trying to figure out if anything that I've missed, and then just being in the spaces, but like, being in the space where there's, no joinery, no furniture, barely any walls. Like I've said, like, I feel like I'm in a big plans, like, where they project the floor plan on the floor and you're like, oh yeah, this seems about right. So that is super exciting. I was like, it feels, whether it feels big or small or whatever, like, I know I'm not like, none of it's real because things are going to, feel differently. Like if you look at, you go to, open for inspection home, and if you see something without furniture, like that's even, that can be, you can't, I don't have a good sense of space there. So let alone a building that's really under construction. But and, just looking, I was like, oh, is that too big? Is like, are we going to have any, are we going to have any back garden left? But, also focusing myself on, and again, credit to Mike, like we made decisions for a reason. They were super well considered. Yes, you have to keep an eye on, any adjustments that we have to make, but, trust the process and feel good about it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's trusting your process, trusting yourself as well, that you spent a lot of time and were super intentional about the decisions when you made them.
Yes.
And so unless there's something really glaringly not kind of meeting your expectations, trusting that that decision was made with, you know, everything that you put into it at that point, and now's not the time necessarily to kind of, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater and revisit it all. So, and I think that's one of those challenges when you're navigating construction. We talk about, you know, when the slab goes down, things will feel small, and then the frame goes up and things start to feel big again, and then, you know, and then a roof goes on and it feels dark, and, you know, you're just sort of like juggling this kind of expectation management around how those spaces feel and those volumes feel.
Usually I'm definitely a third way person. Like, all right, there's this and there's this. Is there some other way that we can, you know, do this? So that's really what we're working through at the moment. It is both about trusting the professional, but also, yeah, just like considering other possibilities. So trying to, go see things. And then I'm just now working towards a discussion where figuring out how to best frame things with them to be able to solve the roofing the outdoor space thing, and then being able to like productively move to the next stage of the landscape design.